In the autumn of 1944, as Allied forces surged across Europe with what seemed like unstoppable momentum, a dark expanse of primeval forest loomed along the German-Belgian border. The Hürtgen Forest. 50 square miles of dense, ancient woodland that would become the stage for one of the most brutal and forgotten battles of World War II. While history remembers the beaches of Normandy and the desperate last stand at the Battle of the Bulge, the Hürtgen Forest remains a shadowy chapter, a meat grinder that consumed tens of thousands of soldiers in conditions so horrific that veterans would later struggle to find words adequate to describe what they endured. The Americans who entered those woods in September 1944 had every reason to believe the war was nearly won. Paris had been liberated in August. The German army appeared to be in full retreat. General Dwight Eisenhower and his staff believed that one final push might end the war before Christmas. The mood among Allied commanders was almost euphoric. But the Hürtgen Forest would shatter that optimism and teach the American army a lesson in humility that would cost more than 30,000 casualties over the course of 3 nightmarish months. The forest itself was unlike anything American soldiers had encountered in their advance across France. These were not the pleasant groves of the French countryside or the rolling hills of Normandy. The Hürtgen was a place of perpetual twilight, where massive fir trees stood so close together that their canopies blocked out the sun even at midday. The forest floor was a tangle of undergrowth, fallen logs, and muddy trails that turned into rivers when the autumn rains came. Visibility was measured in yards, not miles. Radio communication was nearly impossible. The trees absorbed sound and fragmented it, so that soldiers could be killed by an enemy they never saw, from a direction they couldn't identify. The German defenders knew these woods intimately. They had spent months fortifying every ridge, every ravine, every trail junction. They had placed their machine gun nests with surgical precision, creating interlocking fields of fire that could cut down entire platoons in seconds. They had scattered thousands of mines throughout the forest, deadly shoe mines and telemines that could blow a man's leg off or flip a Sherman tank like a toy. And they had developed a tactic that would prove devastatingly effective against the Americans. They had calculated the exact height at which an artillery shell, exploding in the treetops, would shower deadly wooden splinters down onto anyone below. These tree bursts turned the forest itself into a weapon. Soldiers who dove for cover found that the earth offered no protection. The shrapnel came from above, from the trees, splintering trunks and sending razor-sharp fragments of wood and steel, raining down like lethal hail. The American command's decision to attack through the Hürtgen Forest has been debated by military historians ever since. Some argue it was necessary to protect the flank of advancing American armies. Others point to the nearby Roa River dams, whose destruction could potentially flood the valley below and halt any Allied advance. But many believe the battle never should have been fought at all, that the forest could have been bypassed or isolated, that the Germans could have been starved out rather than confronted head-on in terrain that negated every American advantage in armor, air power, and mobility. The first units to enter the forest in mid-September were elements of the 9th Infantry Division. They advanced along narrow fire breaks and logging trails, their progress measured in hundreds of yards per day. Almost immediately they ran into fierce resistance. German positions were virtually invisible until they opened fire. A squad would be walking through what seemed like empty forest, when suddenly machine guns would erupt from camouflaged bunkers, mowing down the lead men before anyone could react. The Germans would then fade back deeper into the woods, forcing the Americans to advance again, into another prepared killing zone. The psychological impact of fighting in the Hürtgen was immediate and devastating. In conventional warfare, soldiers could see the battlefield, could understand the tactical situation, could identify objectives and measure progress. In the Hurtgen, there were no visible objectives, no sense of ground gained or lost. There was only the endless forest, the perpetual gloom, and the constant terror of death from an unseen enemy. Men began to crack under the strain. Combat fatigue, what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder, reached epidemic proportions. Entire companies had to be pulled from the line because their soldiers were no longer capable of functioning. The weather turned the battle into a special kind of hell. Autumn in the Hurtgen brought cold rain that fell for days without stopping. The forest floor became a swamp, foxholes filled with icy water. Trench foot became so widespread that entire battalions were rendered combat ineffective. Soldiers' feet would swell and turn black. In the worst cases, gangrene would set in, and men would lose toes or entire feet to amputation. The cold was relentless. Soldiers couldn't build fires because the smoke would draw enemy artillery. They couldn't even stamp their feet or move around to generate warmth because movement drew sniper fire. They simply had to sit in their water-filled holes, shivering, praying they would survive another night. Supply became a nightmare. The narrow forest trails couldn't handle heavy vehicle traffic, and the constant artillery fire made any movement suicidal. Bringing ammunition, food, and medical supplies forward meant running a gauntlet of fire. Evacuating wounded men was equally treacherous. Medics and stretcher-bearers performed acts of almost unimaginable courage, carrying wounded soldiers through shell fire and sniper fire, often taking hours to move casualties a few hundred yards to an aid station. Many wounded men died not from their injuries, but from shock and exposure, lying in the cold mud for hours before help could reach them. The artillery barrages were unlike anything most veterans had experienced. The Germans had positioned their guns on the high ground east of the forest, and they could drop shells with terrifying accuracy onto any American position. The sound of incoming artillery became the soundtrack of the battle, the shriek of shells followed by the thunderous crack of explosions in the treetops. Soldiers learned to distinguish between different types of incoming fire by sound alone. The Nebelwerfer, the German multi-barreled rocket launcher, made a distinctive screaming sound that earned it the nickname Screaming Mimi among terrified American GIs. When soldiers heard that scream, they had perhaps 3 seconds to find cover before the rockets impacted, each one carrying a warhead that could devastate an area the size of a football field. Individual acts of heroism were commonplace, though many went unrecorded. A private would single-handedly knock out a machine gun nest that was pinning down his platoon. A sergeant would lead a squad in a desperate night attack to retake a lost position. Officers who might have commanded from relative safety instead led from the front, dying alongside their men in muddy clearings whose names nobody remembered. The Medal of Honor was awarded to several soldiers for actions in the Hurtgen, but countless other acts of equal bravery went unwitnessed or unrecorded, lost in the chaos and confusion of forest combat. The small town of Schmidt became a particular focus of the American effort. Perched on a ridge overlooking the forest, Schmidt offered a commanding view of the Rohr River Valley. In early November, the 28th Infantry Division launched an attack to capture the town. The assault began with optimism. American tanks, despite the difficult terrain, managed to push through the forest, and the town fell relatively quickly. But the German counterattack was swift and overwhelming. Panzer units came roaring out of the morning mist, their massive tanks crushing American positions. The 28th Division found itself cut off, surrounded, and systematically destroyed. When the survivors finally staggered back to American lines, the division had been so badly mauled that it was effectively finished as a fighting force. It would take months to rebuild and re-equip the unit. The battle consumed division after division: the 9th Infantry, the 28th Infantry, the 4th Infantry, elements of the 1st Infantry Division, the famed Big Red One. All were fed into the forest and emerged as hollow shells. Replacements arrived at the front with no training in forest warfare, sometimes with barely any infantry training at all. They would be thrust into combat within hours of arriving, given a rifle and pointed toward the German lines. Many of these young soldiers never learned the names of the men fighting beside them before they were killed or wounded. The casualty rates among new replacements were staggering, sometimes reaching 50% within the first 48 hours of combat. As November wore on and the casualties mounted, some officers began to question the entire operation. The forest was eating up divisions faster than they could be replaced. The gains were minimal, measured in hundreds of yards of worthless woodland. The strategic objectives, if they had ever been clear, now seemed increasingly questionable. But the High Command was committed. Too much had been invested, too many men had died, to pull back now. The battle had developed its own terrible momentum, driven by pride and sunk costs rather than sound military strategy. By late November, a new threat emerged from the forest. The Germans were massing forces, not just to defend, but to launch their own offensive. Intelligence reports suggested something big was coming, but the reports were dismissed or downplayed. The American focus remained on capturing the Hurtgen, on pushing through to the Ruhr dams. The idea that the Germans might still be capable of a major offensive seemed absurd. They were supposed to be beaten, in full retreat. And so when the German offensive finally exploded out of the Ardennes forest to the south on December 16, 1944, launching the Battle of the Bulge, it caught the Allies almost completely by surprise. The Hürtgen Forest battle officially ended in mid-December, as units were pulled from the forest to deal with the new crisis in the Ardennes. By then, the Americans had suffered approximately 33,000 casualties. The Germans had lost roughly 28,000. Entire villages within the forest had been obliterated, erased from the map by artillery fire and airstrikes. The forest itself had been transformed into a lunar landscape, with trees shattered into splinters and the ground cratered by thousands of shell impacts. And what had been gained? A few miles of destroyed woodland, control of some villages that no longer existed. The Ruhr dams remained in German hands. The German army, though bloodied, remained intact and capable of launching the most serious counteroffensive the Western Allies would face in Europe. The veterans of the Hürtgen Forest would carry the scars of that battle for the rest of their lives. Many suffered from what was then called battle fatigue or shell shock, waking from nightmares of the forest for decades after the war ended. They had seen things and done things that would haunt them forever. They had watched friends die in ways that were senseless and brutal. They had endured conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. And when they came home, they found that almost nobody wanted to hear about the Hürtgen Forest. The battle had been overshadowed by the more dramatic Battle of the Bulge, by the Rhine crossing, by the final advance into Germany. The Hürtgen became a forgotten battle, a footnote in the history books. Historians and military analysts have spent decades trying to understand what went wrong in the Hürtgen Forest. Some blame the American commanders for stubborn persistence in the face of mounting evidence that the battle was unwinnable. Others point to intelligence failures, to the underestimation of German capabilities, to the overconfidence that followed the rapid advance across France. Still others argue that the battle, while terrible, served a strategic purpose by tying down German divisions that might otherwise have been used in the Ardennes offensive. The debate continues, but one thing is certain. The soldiers who fought in those woods paid a terrible price for whatever strategic benefits the battle may have provided. Walking through the Hürtgen Forest today, it's hard to imagine the carnage that unfolded among these peaceful trees. The forest has regrown. New generations of fir trees reach toward the sky. Hiking trails wind through the woods, and on sunny days, families come to enjoy the natural beauty. But if you know where to look, the evidence of the battle remains. Rusted shell fragments can still be found in the leaf litter. The ground is pocked with depressions that were once foxholes or shell craters. Concrete bunkers, now covered in moss and vines, still dot the landscape. And scattered throughout the forest are small memorials placed by veterans groups and local historians, marking the spots where particular units fought or where mass graves were discovered after the war. The Hürtgen Forest serves as a reminder that not all battles in a just war are themselves just or necessary. It stands as a testament to the courage of ordinary soldiers asked to do impossible things in impossible conditions, and it poses uncomfortable questions about the nature of command, about the price of pride, about the terrible momentum of battles that perhaps should never have been fought. The young men who died in those woods, American and German alike, became casualties not just of war, but of decisions made in distant headquarters by men who never had to crawl through the mud or crouch in a waterlogged foxhole, while artillery shells turned the trees above into deadly splinters. In the grand narrative of World War II, the Hürtgen Forest is often reduced to a brief mention, a minor setback on the road to victory. But for the men who fought there, it was the defining experience of their lives. They went into those woods as part of a victorious army, confident in their cause and their capabilities. They came out, if they came out at all, fundamentally changed. They had seen the face of industrial warfare at its most brutal and senseless. They had learned that courage and determination are not always enough, that good intentions cannot protect you from bad decisions made by those above you in the chain of command. The legacy of the Hürtgen Forest is complex and troubling. It demonstrates the terrible cost of territorial objectives that may have little or no strategic value. It shows how commanders, having committed to a course of action, can become trapped by sunk costs and pride, unable to admit error even as the casualties mount. It reveals the limits of material superiority when fighting on terrain that negates technological advantages, and it honors the memory of tens of thousands of soldiers who fought with extraordinary bravery in a battle that history has largely forgotten. The Hürtgen Forest stands as one of the great tragedies of the Second World War, a place where courage and sacrifice were squandered in pursuit of objectives that, in hindsight, seem questionable at best. The men who fought there deserved better. They deserved commanders who would husband their lives more carefully, who would recognize when a battle had become futile, who would have the moral courage to admit error and pull back. Instead, they were fed into a meat grinder, division after division, until the grinding stopped, not because the objective had been achieved, but because a new crisis demanded their presence elsewhere. Today, when we remember the Second World War, we tend to focus on the clear moral imperative of defeating fascism, on the heroism of D-Day, on the triumph of good over evil, and those things are all true and important. But the Hürtgen Forest reminds us that even in the most just of wars, terrible mistakes are made, and good men die for reasons that have nothing to do with heroism or necessity. It reminds us that we owe it to those who serve to question, always, whether the objectives we set are worth the price we ask them to pay. And it stands as a memorial to all those who fight and die not in glorious charges, but in muddy woods, forgotten by history, remembered only by the few who survived to tell their story.